Okay, welcome Philosophy of Biology class. I'm here with David Livingstone Smith. He's a professor at the University of New England. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Joel, and hi, class.
Hi, David. David, we've read in class so far, we're talking about race and biology right now, and the kind of the overall goal is to try to understand whether biology is relevant to race, and if so, how.
Hmm.
So we read a short piece by Anthony Appiah called Why There Are No Human Races.
Yeah.
And we read Charles Mills' But What Are You Really? The Metaphysics of Race.
Yeah.
Next week,
Yeah.
we plan on reading some discussions of the biology of a biological defense of race. So why don't we start like this? I know that you think that the history of racial thinking is really important for trying to understand race. Can you say a bit about what that history is and why it's so important?
Yeah, well, it's important because it's a terrible history. So let me kind of contextualize what I'm about to say. So as a philosopher, I guess I'm a philosopher. People tell me I am. I kind of think of myself as someone who's trying to figure stuff out, using whatever means I can to figure stuff out. I'm not the sort of person who's interested in purely conceptual issues. And I'm not the sort of person who likes solving puzzles. I know a lot of people are attracted to philosophy because they like to solve puzzles. I can't stand puzzles. So what attracts my interest are topics that I think are really morally serious topics, and topics which, addressed in the proper way, promise to make a positive difference to life on Earth. So if we look back at the history of race, and of course, I'm presupposing some conception of what race is right away, because, what is it that we're looking back at the history of? And we'll get to that. I have a somewhat eccentric view of how race should be understood. If we look back at it, it's a never-ending horror story. It's a story of brutality, of oppression, of genocide, of really some of the worst things that human beings have done to one another. So that's why I go there. And I also go there because my main research interest isn't race per se, it's the phenomenon of dehumanization. But the way I theorize dehumanization is that it's deeply intertwined with racialization. So we can't understand dehumanization unless we have an understanding of race and racialization and racism. And I think racism is pretty much built in to the notion of race, that are far less detachable than I think many would have us think.
So what do you mean by dehumanization? What is that?
Oh, all right. So what I mean by dehumanization, and that's a good question, because, if you Google the term dehumanization, when I last checked, you get about 8 million hits. And even if you kind of shelve all the vernacular uses of the term dehumanization, and you're left with the scholarly uses of the term dehumanization, there are 8 or 10 logically independent conceptions of what that word means. What I mean by dehumanization is the attitude of conceiving of other members of our species as less than human creatures. So it's a puzzling phenomenon, and I mean, just that I said I don't like puzzles, but just that formula is just like weird. How could that be? Well, theorizing dehumanization is the way of trying to explain how that could be, and that's like when we look at examples of dehumanization, like the Holocaust, which involved dehumanization. We find just very, very regularly that the population that gets dehumanized is racialized first. And dehumanization is, well, what I call racism on steroids. It's like a hyped up version of racism.
So you mentioned the Holocaust. So did the Nazis, for example, think of the Jews as a race? Do
Absolutely.
people still think of the Jews as a race? How does that look across cultures?
Yeah, yeah. So that's really important, and a lot of our students don't understand this. So before I get my hands on them, they regularly think, and they're puzzled by why did the Nazis persecute Jews because of their faith? Well, their faith was irrelevant, right? Nazis considered Jews as a race, and a particularly depraved and evil race. Um, the Nazis didn't invent that, right? So if we look on, I'm just working on a chapter on this very topic for my next book. If we look back at, the history of the oppression of Jews in German-speaking lands, Jews start getting racialized, 12th century, 13th century. So this was not like a new invention of the Nazis at all. They were just drawing on deep uh, traditions in German culture. Today, in the white supremacist circles, very often Jews are racialized. Yeah. Not in all white supremacist circles, but certainly amongst neo-Nazis, amongst the real hard far right, these are groups that I follow because of the nature of my research. Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So what do you mean they're racialized? Does it mean that they think of them as a biological group, or?
Good. Yeah.
Yeah.
So as your students know, given what you've read, there are basically three big takes on race, on the metaphysics of race, amongst philosophers and among social scientists. One is, and this is the kind of the old-fashioned one, which was, I guess, predominated into the latter part of the 20th century, that races are biological categories. And they are genuine biological categories, because we have folk biological categories, which are not, they have no biological substance, right? So think of the category of weeds. Well, weeds aren't a natural kind, right? There's nothing biologically unifying about the bunch of plants we call weeds. What makes a plant a weed has to do with our practices of horticulture and so on. It's basically the wild plant growing in a place where we want cultivated plants to grow. But this view, which I'll just call biological realism, the terminology is really inconsistent from one theorist to the next, is that races aren't like weeds, they're like species. That doesn't mean that they are species, but they're biologically respectable categories, that there's some biologically unifying factor that makes it the case that all the folks assigned to a race belong to that race. Okay, so that's one view. Another view, the predominant view, is what I like to call social realism, which is that, yeah, races are inventions, but lots of inventions are perfectly real, right? Like the computers that we're both using right now. I mean, those are material inventions, but there are also cognitive inventions. Dollars, right? Dollars are really virtual things. They're kind of instantiated by these pieces of paper, decreasingly now. But dollars are real, and if you doubt that, hey, give me access to your bank account, right? So that's social realism, and most philosophers buy into one or another version of that. And then there's what I like to call anti-realism. I don't like the term eliminativism because I think that's better applied to a slightly different issue, which is whether we should persist in using racial terminology. And that comes apart from the metaphysical issue. So we have this spectrum of views. Now, let's shove biological realism to the side. Or rather, no, because we're addressing the JQ, as the white supremacists call it, the Jewish question. So Nazis thought that, and I'm going to qualify this in a second, Jews were a distinct biological category. That's why, when confronted with the problem, which they didn't satisfactorily solve at all, of determining who was a Jew and who wasn't a Jew, well, they didn't go to religious belief, at least in the first instance. So Jews who had converted to Christianity were still Jews. They looked at ancestry, right? So, in Nazi Germany, show me your papers meant show me your racial papers. And there were rules which were worked out in a somewhat arbitrary manner about how many Jewish grandparents you had to have in order to be Jewish, or in order to be a Mischling, a mixed race person. Now, problem with this, of course, was they were committed to an infinite regress, because they would really logically have to identify which grandparents were Jewish. So the idea was that Jewishness was transmitted biologically by descent. There was an actual live debate about whether the biological transmission had to be by descent. So those who committed what was called Rassenschande, race traitorship, by having sex with Jewish people, according to some of the Nazi race experts, could be transformed into Jews, virtue of having sex.
I've heard that, yeah.
Yeah, the background idea was through bodily fluids. So they definitely believed that being Jewish was transmitted in the blood, that the Jewish essence, we haven't talked about essentialism yet, but it's creeping in, even though we haven't named it, came in the blood. So that's why blood supplies were segregated. They were in the United States too, by the way. Black and white blood were segregated on the battlefields of World War II. And in fact, there was a case of a Jewish doctor being prosecuted for saving the life of a Nazi stormtrooper who urgently needed a supply of blood, and he gave his own blood and saved this guy's life.
But polluted him, right?
Polluted him, yes. That's right.
Yeah. So what if I say, well, what's wrong with the biological view? I think Jews that's just a mistake, right? They're not actually a biological category. And we know that because now we can do, for example, DNA testing, which is really getting a thing. Now, I mean, there are people say, look, the Ashkenazi Jews have, Tay-Sachs disease or other particular genetic things. So, but maybe that's the wrong category. Maybe, the right categories are things like, there's European and Sub-Saharan African and, Pacific Islander and Southeast Asian. And I'll say, we shouldn't have loaded all the, we shouldn't kill them, of course, but why not just acknowledge that they're different? That these really are different kinds of people. What's wrong with that view?
Well, there are two things wrong with it, and they're related to one another. First of all, there's a kind of a grain problem there. So let's start with the other issue. People confuse race with variation. Of course, there's a huge amount of variation amongst human beings. We're very variable animals. And some of those variations are linked to geographical origins. So where were most of your ancestors 600 years ago? Well, there are phenotypes associated with those patterns of descent. But, there's something really weird about answering that question, where were your ancestors, most of your ancestors 600 years ago, by saying Europe. Europe is an artificial construction, right? So why there? Now, races are supposed to be, the way they actually work in everyday life And I think that's the real importance of these sorts of
Mhm.
issues. I don't care about fancy philosophical notions of race in particular. That's fun to play with, but what makes race so serious
Mhm.
is the way it works in social life. Um, where was I going with that? Um, so, so it seems rather arbitrary. All right, here's where I was going with it.
Yeah.
So these are supposed to be privileged categories. They're supposed to be really informative. That's the way they work.
Mhm.
So we talk about white rather than from the Rhineland or Danish or whatever.
Mhm.
And in fact, when we use those categories like Danish, we're also drawing on artificially carved out populations, right?
Mhm.
So sub-Saharan Africa, well, Jesus, that covers a lot of territory. It
Mhm.
covers immense amount of biological variation, an immense amount of cultural variation, linguistic variation, and so
Mhm.
on. So if we look at the history of that way of carving up populations, what we find is there are historical explanations for that carving up. It's not like people have gone out and looked and said, well, this is, there's a biological unity here.
Mhm.
That's utterly false. I think race should be understood. Race is often conflated with variation. So when I talk to students, I try to, the students are very self-conscious about talking this stuff. And I teach in Maine, it's like wall-to-wall whiteness, right? So, they want to say the wrong thing, and that's kind of sweet. But when I say, I don't believe in race, I'm sure a lot of them are thinking you're nuts. And I'm
Mhm.
sure what a lot of them are thinking is, well, you just have to look around you.
Yeah.
But what you see when you look around you is variation. Race, I think, is best understood as a folk theory of variation.
Mhm.
So it's an attempt to answer the question, why is there so much phenotypic variation in the world?
Mhm.
And the answer, which is a scientifically bad one, is there are a very few pure types of human beings.
Mhm.
Everyone on Earth is either an exemplar of one of those types or a mixture of two or more of them.
Mhm.
Um, I don't even remember our starting point for this discourse.
Well, I said, what's wrong with the biological view?
Okay, okay,
So
well,
one thing that you
that's a
might
lot.
think is wrong, and I think this is the defenders of the biological view sometimes go like this. They say, you're right. Historically, it's loaded with all these totally immoral attitudes.
Mhm.
But if and the reason that you don't like it, you say you're an anti-realist, and I'm like, oh no, you're just making a mistake. You're
Mhm.
mistaking a moral view for a biological one, right? The
Mhm.
moral view that we shouldn't, um, have a hierarchy of races or something like that.
Yeah, yeah,
And then some people say that that's built into race from the very beginning,
yeah,
and so therefore we can't have races. And the biological realists, I think the good ones, will say, um, well, they don't have to be
yeah,
hierarchical like that,
yeah.
but we shouldn't, throw out the baby with the bathwater, as it were,
Well,
and we should just acknowledge the truth of, these clusters of variation or something like that. So that's how we got started.
okay. And so I have no objection to acknowledging clusters of variation,
Hmm.
right?
But you
Provided
think they're not races?
recognized, right? No,
Yeah.
no, they do have some basis too, right? So the first issue is there are clusters of variation at various grains.
Hmm.
I think Sarah Tishkov says something like we should think of Africa as having like 17 of these, or something.
Hmm.
I think
Yeah.
I'm getting it slightly wrong. So the idea of chunking these things the way that we chunk them, which
Hmm.
has an historical explanation, it does not have a biological
Hmm.
explanation. That's one issue, right? So if we're going to be really biological about it, let's forget about those categories and work from the ground up. And then we're not going to end up with the same categories that we've inherited from
Hmm.
the 18th century. I
Yeah.
would be most surprised. That would be
Yeah.
miraculous. So that's one bit.
Hmm.
Second, clusters of variation. Well, we could talk about genotypic variation. We could talk about phenotypic variation. If we're talking about phenotypic variation, the way phenotypes get clustered, there's a real problem, like in judging similarities between phenotypes,
Hmm.
like what matters.
Mhm.
for doing this. And when things are divided up racially, of course, what you see is that certain phenotypes matter and certain don't. So skin color of a certain shade matters, but ear shape doesn't matter. Arbitrary example. And what ends up mattering, again, is historically determined,
Mhm.
right? It's not like we're
Yeah.
starting with a clean slate here. Third and finally, actually, two more things. Third, if we're looking at genotype population clustering, what we get are statistical facts about populations,
Mhm.
but nothing like necessary and sufficient conditions for inclusion in the
Right.
group, right? And what these statistical facts tell us is really, really interesting. They tell us about population structure, but they are properties of entire populations, not properties of individuals that make up those
Right.
populations, right? So to conflate the two, and that's how
Mhm.
the notion race as it is normally used is supposed to be a property of individuals. Your race is supposed to be a property of you,
Yeah.
right? So that doesn't, there's kind of a disjunct between the, say, the stuff you'd get out of the structure studies
Mhm.
and the way the concept of race works. And fourth, and I think most significantly, I think it's absolutely fine to, in principle, to change the subject. And we'll call race this kind of fancy
Mhm.
thing. But the fact is, we tend to default to the folk conception of race. As soon as the term race comes up,
Mhm.
we tend to default because of certain kinds of essentialistic proclivities and the historical weight of racial ideologies. So let's talk about variation. Let's do it from the ground up, not
Mhm.
trying to justify 18th century categories.
Yeah.
And that's really cool. That's a great
Yeah.
project.
Well, maybe this biological thing is going to be important if I ask. So, we read Charles Mills. So if I say, look, the anti-realist view doesn't really make sense. Scientists study race. They might make some claim like black infant mortality is much higher than white infant mortality in the United States.
Yeah.
Why? Because race matters, right? Race
Yeah.
is a real fact about
Yeah.
people. And if we look at the cases from Charles Mills, I'm sure you'll remember like Mr. Oreo, for example.
Yeah, it's such a great
And
experiment.
so, the students are like, well, of course he's black. Everybody knows he's black. He's got dark skin. His ancestry is black. Everyone's going to treat him that way. And so
Mhm.
what Mills will say is it's a fact. It's an objective fact. It's true. It's made true by us, but it's an objective fact that he's going to be treated differently than, for example, you or I are going to be treated.
For sure.
So why not acknowledge the truth of that fact? And then we can ask about, what its source is. But, what if I just flat out say, look, anti-realism is just kind of off the table. There's just, race is a real thing.
You know who else is going to get treated differently? And this is perfectly, plugged into Mills's wonderful paper. I love that paper. I teach it every time I teach race. Uh, uh, Black people who pass as white,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they're treated differently once their ancestry is discovered.
Right.
Once they reveal it or once it's
Mm-hmm.
discovered. So what's going on there? Well, it's not how they look. It's not how they talk. It's not how they act. It's whom they're descended from.
Right.
Now, why is that? See, I think we need to ask a deeper question there. Why does descent matter here? And I think it matters because of what I think is the fact that for the most part, racial conceptions are suffused with essentialistic thinking and folk biological assumptions,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what that means is if we start from a phenotype, we very quickly end up with this folk metaphysically loaded
Mm-hmm.
conception, and loaded with stuff that has no place in a scientific understanding of human variation at all. So I can perfectly accept, yeah. In fact, I'll use the term like black and white,
Mm-hmm.
making when I need to. But here's how the way I want to use them as convenient descriptors, right? Like I would say tall or short. Now, what if there's in fact, there is such a society where short men are discriminated against. It's our society, right? Um, okay, so that's meaningful socially,
Mm-hmm.
right? But do I want to then reify some category of shortness? I don't.
Yeah.
No. So
Um,
yeah, of course, these are
yeah.
socially significant
Yeah,
descriptions.
but what about this? You had mentioned, the reason I brought this up is you had mentioned this kind of, if history were different,
Mm,
we would have carved up the races different.
yeah.
And that to me sounds like part of a justification of a social constructivist view. So the idea is that, so as you were saying, the Jews were racialized
Hmm.
in a certain time period. Well, then it's a fact. It really was a fact that this person was treated a certain kind of way. The Jews
Yeah.
were a race. And now maybe in the
Yeah.
21st century in the United States, most of us don't think of Jews as a race.
Yeah.
But we will lump together various, you're from, you know, Kenya, or you're from the Congo, or you're from,
Mhm.
Morocco. And I might say, well, you say those are very different cultures. And I'll say, well, but they're going to be treated the same way in the United States.
Sure.
That's a fact about the United States today.
Mhm.
On the other hand, um, if history were different, we might have carved them up differently, and then they would be different. Or I think, I don't think Mills points this out, but you've made it in other cases, like, Italians were a race, or Irish were a race.
Yes.
And
That's right.
it's not just that, people talked about Italians, or they really were treated as a race, because that's a real thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, what here? I think there's a scope issue with the word,
Good.
right? They were really treated as a race.
Yeah.
That doesn't make them really a race, right? So there's
Mm.
the well-worn example in the literature of witches.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean that was you could get killed for being regarded as a witch. Now the question is, did that make you a witch? And I say, no, it didn't make you a witch. Why didn't it make you a witch? Because the individuals who were thought to be witches didn't satisfy the description of a
Mm.
witch. They didn't, consort with the devil in the woods once a month and stuff like that. So a
Yeah.
lot of what's going on here, I think, has to do with our take about what's really being said of people when we classify them as a member of one or another race. Like, what's the job description? What does anyone need to satisfy?
Hmm.
And you know the way that people knee-jerkly address this is things like, well, it's how they look. But that's not the case. Passing shows us this. The fact that there are numerous uh, dark-skinned populations in the world who are racialized differently. Um, so what is going on? I think what's going on are these covert folk metaphysical assumptions, and that's why I'm an anti-realist rather than a social realist.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned early on that there's a difference between anti-realism and eliminativism. So,
Yeah.
before we go, I want to make sure to ask about that. So, you've convinced your students, we've had a whole semester to talk, they're anti-realists, but, now what? Do you think, for moral reasons, we should kind of get rid of racial talk, or maybe for moral reasons, we should recognize that it's really important that we've treated people a certain way, and we should, should we, you said you were kind of okay with a
Mhm.
careful
Very
replacement of
thin. Yeah.
being,
Yeah.
race being a biological but not important category. So, what do we think? What do you think we should do, and why?
Well, that's such a hard question. So I want to respond to it in a way that isn't just some kind of philosophical fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
So I think eliminating racial discourse, like you could legislate that, that's a philosopher's fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
That's not going to happen. Um,
Well, we could, for example, not use race in our laws. I mean, we're not going to legislate that you can't use race in your personal life,
Yeah.
but maybe racial terms, like maybe we shouldn't put it on the census. Um, you know, that
Yeah,
might
well,
help.
I don't think we're at that point either, because the point of the census has to be intelligible to folks that fill out the census. There are contexts where I think it should be, race talk should be eliminated. It should be eliminated in medicine, for instance. And there are plenty of alternatives to use, which actually would arguably be much, much better. If I can tell you a little story, I brought Dorothy Roberts to my school to speak about race in medicine a few years ago, and one of the faculty told the following story. He's Chilean, and he went to the doctor uh, with some symptom or other, and he said to the doctor, "I think it's Crohn's disease," and the doctor said, "No, no, Mexicans don't get Crohn's disease." Right. Well, there's so much wrong on so many levels.
That's right. Yeah.
But he said to the guy, "Look, I'm not Mexican."
Yeah.
Doctor, didn't matter, right? Look at the job that race is playing in that story, right? And it's all too often that way. I mean, there are these shortcuts which can be helpful, but they can be really harmful as well. So medicine, in other contexts, I think we can certainly encourage people to use different language, right? Rather than race language, say racialization. I think racialization is a great term. But I'm not real optimistic about a solution to this problem in the foreseeable future.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, David. I'm sure my students will enjoy this. I know we'll be thinking about this and
Awesome. It was fun talking to you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. I'm gonna.
Bye, man. Bye-bye. Stay safe.
Okay. Bye.